Thank you very much. Oops. Yes. Thank you very much, Konstantin. I'm very honored to give these lectures and very grateful to the invitation, and in particular to my hosts. If you looked up the website for this lecture, you may well think that a kind of publicity ploy is involved. At the top, you find an engraving of a distinguished gentleman with a well-kempt beard, Tudor headgear, and a Toby collar. But I stopped wearing such gear a long time ago. As you scroll down, you do find a photo of me, but it is, shall we say, rather dated. In my defense, I sent them a much more recent photograph of mine, but it was turned down by the authorities as unseemly because it depicts me wearing sunglasses and looking relaxed. And I thought it was the Swiss and the Germans who are uptight and formal. In any event, I've learned my lesson and I'll present myself in my best suit to you. What I have to say is straight-laced in other respects as well. As I reread the abstract, I thought, well, gosh, this is just common sense. But I hope to convince you that, common sense regarding animals may be pedestrian, but need not therefore be flat-footed. I have just 4 take-home messages in this lecture. The first one is that the moral status, the respect we owe to different species of animals, depends on their mental capacities, on what they are like in the mental department, just as tradition and common sense would have it. It's been denied recently. Secondly, that philosophical arguments against the very possibility of animals possessing morally relevant capacities fail. So I do think animals can do a lot more than some people would have us believe. Thirdly, many animals actually possess some of these morally relevant capacities, and some animals possess many of them. We're talking about capacities for pain, for perception, for belief, for desire, and so on. Nonetheless, and this is, I guess, a message which will, be less favorably received by many, I think there is a case for holding that our moral obligations to each other are of a different order from our moral obligations towards animals. So what we owe to each other has a different quality from what we owe to animals. Okay, soaps. Okay, preview. So I'll start with a few terminological clarifications on humans, animals, and ethics. In particular, I'll distinguish 2 topics: animal ethics, which deals with the question of how we should treat animals, and what I call animal morals, which is the idea that animals themselves have moral attitudes and emotions. And in section 2, I will reject that idea. I don't think animals themselves have morality. It doesn't mean that we shouldn't treat them morally, but they themselves don't have morality. Then I'll try to substantiate my first take-home message, namely that moral status depends on what animals can do in the mental department. And I'll follow that up by 2 sections, one on sentience, in particular pain, and one on interests, having an interest in something. And there I shall try to substantiate my messages 2 and 3, namely that animals can, in principle, have the sort of mental properties which make you worthy of moral respect and give you moral status. And then in the final section, I shall try to draw some conclusions from the mental powers of animals for the way we should treat them, and that's where I will claim that although animals have rights and must be treated with respect, they are what we owe to them is of a different kind. Then I have got two appendices, but you'll probably be spared these on grounds of good behavior. Okay, so, oops, gosh, well, this could be interesting. It's a way of making a short paper look. Okay, well, anyway, terminological clarification. When I speak of animals, I mean non-human and non-linguistic animals. We are animals as well, but, I will just employ the term in an exclusive fashion. Now, a question that I've been working on is what I call the question of animal minds. Do some animals have minds, mental properties, mental powers comparable to those of humans? Now, there are different answers you can give to this question. I distinguish two. There is what I call differentialism, which maintains that there are fundamental qualitative mental differences between humans and animals. And there is what I call assimilationism. It assimilates humans and animals and maintains that the differences are merely quantitative. There's also a philosophical monster called lingualism, which is one of my special bogies. Lingualism maintains that it is the lack of language which bars animals from many mental properties. So, lingualism maintains that animals can't, for instance, have beliefs or desires because the beliefs and desires would require language. And when I speak of a language here, I mean a public language, notably a natural language like Swahili or Swiss German or English. I don't mean the language of thought that many cognitive scientists appeal to. Okay. Oh dear. Okay, I'm really sorry, but it will give you a chance to digest all the important messages that I have. So why do animals matter? Why are we interested in animals? The question of animal minds has exercised philosophy and science in the Western tradition since their inception, and let me just add, I shall only talk about the Western tradition for the very simple reason that I don't know enough about anything else. Now, there are three reasons for this interest. One is what I call zoological, the intrinsic interest of animals and their behavioral capacities. It's just, frightfully fascinating what they can do. A second one is anthropological. Animals serve as objects of comparison when it comes to clarifying what we humans are like. When we try to find out what humans are like, what distinguishes us, we need animals as objects of comparison. And finally, we have an ethical interest because the moral status of animals is widely held to depend on their behavioral capacities and on their mental properties. Now, this ethical connection has two dimensions. There is what I call animal ethics. It revolves around the question of how we should treat animals, whether we have any obligations towards them, and of what kind these obligations are. And there's what I call animal morals, namely, do animals themselves have moral beliefs, attitudes, sentiments, or practices? So, animal ethics concerns animals as objects, as topics of moral consideration, and as bearers of moral value and status. Animal morals concerns animals as subjects of moral consideration, as potentially making moral evaluations themselves and behaving in a moral fashion. Okay, now animal morals and animal ethics are connected. If you are a subject of moral consideration, if you can entertain thoughts about the well-being of others, the fairness towards others, then you are, I think, also a proper object of moral consideration. I can't envisage any kind of animal that could, entertain moral considerations towards others, but which wouldn't be deserving of moral consideration in turn. Conversely, having a moral status, being an object of moral respect, may, I emphasize, may require being a subject, e.g. showing moral considerations oneself. There is a very important position in Western thought called contractualism, which thinks that morality is a matter of an agreement into which rational beings enter. So only creatures able to enter into some kind of agreement with us or reciprocating our moral concern can be fully fledged beneficiaries of moral consideration. So, to put it bluntly, if animals are nice to each other and to us, we don't have to be nice to them. Okay? I think that's thoroughly mistaken, but it is an important position. Okay, animal morals. Now, I am skeptical about attributing fully fledged moral capacities even to the most intelligent animals. Having said that, it's clear that animals share with us biological vulnerabilities. For instance, they are susceptible to suffering pain. They share with us emotions. And these vulnerabilities and emotions are, if you wish, essential to the motivation of human beings to behave in a moral fashion. So, these are components of human morality. And it is also true that intelligent social animals display forms of altruism. They perform actions which benefit others and are of no direct benefit to themselves. But the kind of altruism you see in animals, for instance in primates, are of two kinds. One is reciprocal altruism. It's a kind of quid pro quo. Yeah, I'm nice to you because I count on you being nice to me later. And the other type is kinship altruism, namely being altruistic to biological relatives. So these forms of altruism are well documented. There is also, I think, the kind of altruism which we would call altruism, and which I call psychological altruism, where you behave in an altruistic manner because you want to help others without any immediate, if you wish, hope for a kickback. Yeah, so you think, oh, I want to help this other human being, irrespective of whether it's related to me or whether it is going to benefit myself. In order to do that, I have to entertain some beliefs about what the person I want to help wants and believes. I want, in order to be altruistic in this fashion, consciously altruistic, I must be able to entertain beliefs about what another person wants, right? If I help someone out of the bus and she hadn't planned to alight the bus, this would not go down terribly well. What animals who have that kind of altruism need is a type of mind reading. They must be capable of entertaining beliefs about what others believe and want. Now, there's only anecdotal evidence to the effect that animals have what I call psychological altruism, and I think that anecdotal evidence is suspect. I'll tell you later why, or a bit why. Conversely, there is sound evidence of a pertinent difference between humans and even our closest relatives, the great apes. The differences concern cooperation and sense of justice. It's a unique feature of humans from a very early age onwards that they help one another. They engage in collaborative tasks, and they will continue to participate in collaborative efforts, even if they have already received a reward. So there are interesting experimental setups where two agents need to sort of ratchet up a bar, and it goes on one side and then on the other side, one side and the other side, and at some point the agent here receives a reward. A human child, on the other hand, the agent here receives a reward. And then, nevertheless, that human agent will take the final step to ensure that its collaborator also receives a reward. A chimpanzee, no bloody way. If the chimpanzee has its reward, it's not wickedness, it just doesn't entertain the idea that, with one last heave, the other person or the other agent could also gain a reward. So that's one point. So they really down their tools immediately, even if it would just require minimal effort. Another point, another difference is what one might call a sense of justice, or I think more appropriately, fairness. There have been much publicized experiments which suggest that if you, for instance, give two macaques different food items, one of them gets a peanut and the other one gets a cucumber. Peanuts are favored and cucumbers are disfavored. I can understand that. I dislike cucumbers. Then the macaque who gets the cucumber doesn't eat it but throws it away. It feels treated unjustly, the experimenters have claimed. But it seems to me, first of all, these findings have not been corroborated, which is always a bit suspicious. But what this kind of experiment, even if it holds water, would show is only that monkeys have what's called an egocentric inequity aversion. I am terribly upset if I get less than others. I don't think that's a sense of fairness at all. A sense of fairness would include that I also have an other regarding sense of fairness, what's called allocentric inequity aversion. Now, if you point out that difference, the people I am criticizing here will say, well, look, they don't have our sense of justice. They have a special primate sense of justice. But a sense of justice which reduces to wanting more for yourself, I mean, frankly, that is just Hamlet without the Prince of Denmark. That's just not morality at all. It's a important sentiment, an important attitude, but it has got nothing to do with morality. Okay, so this is a very brief comment on why I don't think animals themselves are moral. There are other findings to similar effects. Now, it's very interesting, the assimilationists are the people who assimilate humans and animals, And normally, when they're presented with the findings of behavioral science, cognitive ethology as it's nowadays called, they take these findings at face value when they are positive. Yeah, if they show that animals can do things they had hitherto been regarded as incapable of, the assimilationists lap it up and say, there you see it. You present them with a negative finding, and then all of a sudden they develop skepticism and query these findings. Very peculiar. So, when there are findings which suggest that animals lack a moral morality, moral sentiments, then all of a sudden people say, oh, but who says that these have been methodologically sound, etc., etc. If they had been positive, there would not have been any skepticism of this kind. In the same spirit, the very famous ethologist Frans de Waal suggests that negative results that animals cannot do certain things, should, from the start be treated with suspicion. We should dismiss negative results. I find this very disquieting because it's well known that in empirical science in general, there is what's called a positive results bias. It's much easier to find that such and such does occur, that such and such is possible, than to get a finding published which says, well, look, such and such things are not possible. So this is called positive results bias, and that is a systemic malaise in empirical science in general. So if someone starts out and says we shouldn't, take negative results seriously, that seems to me to be, a serious abrogation of scientific responsibility. Positive results bias is a malaise in empirical science in general, and in cognitive ethology, the study of animal behavior and capacities, the bias is exacerbated by the anticipated media uptake. Yeah, if you announce, for example, ravens engage in power politics and entertain moral judgments, that will be headline news. Next day, front page news. If you publish a result, chimpanzees lack a sense of justice, forget it. That's even less exciting than this lecture. So, there's a very strong incentive to claim more and more and more and more on behalf of animals. And there's also, I think, a well-intentioned, but in my view, misguided desire to make animals look worthy of moral consideration. Yeah? I don't think you should diverge from the path of strict scientific truth in order to achieve a result, even if that is a result maybe morally desirable. Okay, mental capacities and moral status. Now this, refusal to take seriously negative results is just one instance of moral and ideological prejudices vitiating debates about animal minds. Many verdicts on animal minds are propelled neither by empirical evidence nor by philosophical argument, but by a desire to either affirm or deny that animals are worthy of certain degrees of moral consideration and legal protection. Now, in my view, this is to put the cart before the horse. The rational procedure is first to determine the morals, is to determine the moral status of animals on the basis of their morally relevant properties. First, you determine what animals are like, and then you decide how they should be treated. I really don't see any coherent alternatives to that procedure. That still leaves open the question of how the morally relevant properties of animals are related to their mental capacities. Is it really the mental capacities of animals that make them worthy of moral consideration? Some recent positions regard the connection as less tight than the orthodox approach in animal ethics, which is nowadays called the psychological approach. The psychological approach of early animal rights activists like Singer and Reagan thought we should treat animals well because they have certain moral powers, and there are recent positions which deny this. Now here's a very popular line of reasoning. I find it again and again in assimilationists, people who align animals closely with humans. The reasoning runs as follows. First premise, if moral status depends on mental capacities, and if animals lack certain mental capacities, then they will not be full members of the moral community. This is something which is terribly important to many assimilationists. Animals must be full members of the moral community. And if moral status depends on what kind of mind you have, and if animals lack the kind of mind we have, then they would not be full members of the moral community. But now animals are full members of the moral community. Therefore, either moral status does not depend on the mental capacities they have, or they do possess all the relevant mental capacities. So one or the other must be the case, because we assume that animals are full members of the moral community. But of course, that premise, animals are full members of the moral community, simply begs the question. The basic question of animal ethics is exactly, are animals members of the moral community, and to what extent? So, I really find this, a blatant case of begging the question. Nevertheless, there may be independent arguments which show that moral status does not depend on mental powers. So, this is something we must investigate. Perhaps these people are nonetheless right that, whether an animal can think or feel, or etc., that is not what determines whether it has moral rights. Okay, now here are, I will go through a few arguments to the effect that we shouldn't make our treatment of animals dependent on their mental abilities. The first argument is the accusation of anthropocentrism, of placing human beings in the center of the universe in a way which is illicit. So, making moral status dependent on cognitive capacities, it's sometimes called the similar minds approach, is woefully anthropocentric. We regard us as the measure of all things. Why should animals only deserve moral respect insofar as they resemble humans? Now, I think, that question is worth considering, but it misses the point. The psychological approach does not make moral status dependent on similarity to us. It doesn't say animals aren't like us, therefore we should treat them badly. It says animals lack certain morally relevant properties. Yeah? Of course, these are properties which we seem to possess. We can feel pain, we can feel pleasure, we can have desires, interests, plans for the future. But the argument is not, okay, these properties are important because we have them. The argument is rather these properties are important because our moral principles and concepts refer to these properties. So the position, the psychological approach is based on the idea that our mental and moral concepts are closely interconnected. Now, those concepts, concepts like suffering, concepts like pleasure, concepts like having a right. Now, those concepts may be anthropocentric. They are our concepts, and they reflect our interests and our powers of discrimination. Yeah? Obviously, moral concepts are human concepts. But, and that may, to that extent, our concepts are anthropocentric, but our concepts are none the worse for reflecting our interests and our powers of discrimination, and there's no coherent alternative. Even assuming that, let's say, zebras have concepts, which is very dubious, and even assuming that they have moral concepts, I don't know what they are. I don't know whether they would deserve the label moral to begin with. So, of course, when it comes to considering the question of how to treat zebras, I rely on, human moral concepts. I ask myself, can they suffer pain? Do they have plans for the future? Do they have a memory? Do they fear death, etc.? These are all human concepts. Okay. No, I'll skip that. I discovered that there may be something wrong. I was taught today that there may be something wrong here. There's a workshop leading up to this event, so and I try to learn. Now, another argument against the idea that it is the mental capacities of animals which determines their moral status is associated with the so-called vulnerability approach, or the ethics of care. So human beings should not exploit animals which are vulnerable, i.e. susceptible to harm, or dependent on humans for their well-being or survival. So we shouldn't treat animals well on account of what they can do, but on account of their being vulnerable or susceptible. So it's, if you wish, if you think that through properly, the more, one might say, it's a consequence, the more an animal can do, the less deserving of moral respect it is, because the more an animal can do, the less vulnerable it is. Now, as I said, this contrasts with the psychological approach of earlier animal rights activists or theorists, which maintained that animals should be protected because of their capacities, their powers, their abilities, not because they're vulnerable. Now, I think the vulnerability approach goes right in acknowledging that our treatment of animals should be guided by their morally relevant properties. Being vulnerable is still a morally relevant property of the animal. It's not something which depends on us. So I think in that respect they are right. They would add that these properties, the morally relevant properties, are not mental capacities, they are rather vulnerabilities, susceptibility to harm. But can mental capacities and vulnerabilities really come apart? The argument of the vulnerability approach assumes that there's a difference between mental capacities on the one hand and vulnerabilities on the other, and that the two can, in fact, come apart. So there could be creatures, or beings, I should say, that have mental powers but aren't vulnerable, and the other way around. What are the options? Well, one possibility is that mental capacities do not imply vulnerability, because an omnipotent being, God, has the former. It has mental capacities, but it doesn't have the latter. Now, this cross indicates that I'm not really enamored to this possibility, for the simple reason that I find the notion of an omnipotent being incoherent, I must admit. Yeah, I do find the traditional monotheistic conception of God as omnipotent, omniscient, and benevolent, incoherent. So I'll disregard it in the sequel. A second possibility is that vulnerability does not require genuine mental capacities, since the former, namely vulnerability, only requires sentience, whereas genuine mental capacities require the intellect. They must be rational capacities. I'll also reject that. And then, oh God, there's a mistake here. The third possibility is that you can have vulnerability without mind, because some non-animals, not non-organisms, some non-animals are susceptible to frustration of their needs. So you don't need to have a mind to be vulnerable, and if vulnerability implies being a subject of moral consideration, then you don't need a mind in order to be a subject, an object of moral consideration. And I find some truth in this, and I'll elaborate on these two possibilities. The first possibility, mind and intellect. There is a very venerable tradition in Western thought, Aristotelianism, which regards only the faculty of reason, the faculty of intellect, as mental. The mind equates to the intellect. In that case, sentience, and that is the, if you wish, paradigmatic form of moral vulnerability, does not amount to anything mental. The fact that a creature can feel pain is simply not a mental fact. It may be morally relevant, but it has got nothing to do with having mental capacities. But it seems to me that this Aristotelian demarcation, there is the mind, which equates to reason or intellect on the one hand, and then there's all this lower stuff, including the capacity for feeling pain. I think that is not in line with the currently established use of terms like mental, mind, etc. John Stuart Mill, I'm not sure he's not from Hertfordshire by any chance. Oh, shame. So John Stuart Mill already I know where he's from. John Stuart Mill inveighed against a popular perversion, as he called it, by which the word mind is withdrawn from its rightful generality of signification and restricted to the intellect. Yeah. So I do think that feeling pleasure and pain may be more primitive than reasoning, but it is not. It's therefore not outside the sphere of the mental. Now I do think it is in line with our current demarcation of the mind to draw the line at creatures that possess sentience, that feel pleasure, pain, have perception. So Prince Charles notwithstanding, I don't think that plants have minds, okay? But nonetheless, that's not to say that plants are morally irrelevant. In my view, they are irrelevant because plants, although they don't have minds, they have needs. They have biological needs relating to their metabolism and their procreation, and that means that they are vulnerable in a non-metaphorical sense, for their needs can either be satisfied or frustrated. So, if you deprive a plant of water, not to mention if you simply cut it down, then you interfere with its flourishing, you interfere with the satisfaction of its biological needs. So there's a case for holding that the needs of all organisms possess some moral weight, even if that weight may be rather slender compared to more pressing moral demands. So I do think that wantonly destroying plants is not just, ecologically problematic, needless to say, or aesthetically problematic. I think it's morally problematic. So to that extent, the vulnerability approach has a point with respect to our treatment of non-human life. It's quite right. Vulnerability is what guarantees moral status. So the presence of needs suffices for minimal moral status, is my view. And to that extent, of course, not just plants, but all living things have at least a minimal moral status. But I think the vulnerability approach goes wrong in contrasting the morally pertinent features of animals with their capacities. I think it's led astray by an unduly literal understanding of notions like capacity, ability, power. I mean, those terms do carry a connotation of activity and control. I admit that, but I think that's just a connotation. It's not essential to having a capacity if you reconsider the matter thoroughly. There are both active and passive powers, or both active and there are powers under our control and powers beyond our control. One capacity, and it's clearly a mental capacity, which is not under the possessor's control, is perception. This is a rarely noted point, but perception is clearly a mental power, but it's not under my control. I have the power to see my environment, right? But I can't decide what I see, right? I can decide not to look. But, once I look, I can't decide, oh, the lecture hall is empty, I can do a trial run. Yeah. There's no such thing as deciding to perceive one thing or another. It's not under my control. And of course, it's also, if you wish, a passive power, because it means taking in information about the external world. So this is an example of a capacity, in my view, but it is a passive capacity which is not under my control. And being susceptible to external influences is a capacity, at least insofar as it enables the possessor of the capacity to respond appropriately to the environment. Yeah? It's good that I can't decide to perceive the lecture hall as empty, because otherwise I'd be talking even more rubbish than I currently do. So, the fact that it's not under my control is an advantage in the long run. Being sensitive to pain, for instance, is passive compared to being able to react to a source of pain. Feeling the pain in my left foot is passive compared to my ability to scratch my left foot or assuage an injury, but it is still a mental capacity, just like perception. And we should keep in mind that congenital insensitivity to pain is a serious affliction, a very serious affliction. You're in all manner of trouble if, congenitally you're not able to feel pain. Okay. So, possession of psychological capacities such as sentience, feeling pleasure and pain, or intentions or thoughts about the future are both necessary and sufficient for the vulnerabilities that are the preserve of animals. Yeah, so if we're looking at animals and disregard plants for the time being, then having psychological capacities ensures that you are vulnerable, and it is also necessary for you being vulnerable. You can't separate vulnerabilities and mental capacities in the way in which the vulnerability approach requires. Without sentience, no pain. Without intentions, no frustrations. Without thoughts about the future, no fear of death, etc., etc. So it's clear, I take it that feeling pain, being frustrated in your intentions, or fearing death, these are morally relevant features. Yeah, it seems to me clear that you should not inflict pain, you should try to provide pleasure. It's clear that you should not interfere with a subject pursuing its intentions, it is clear to me that you should not kill a being that is afraid of death. But all of these morally relevant properties presuppose mental capacities. So, and conversely, without vulnerability to noxious stimuli, to harmful stimuli, no sentience without the risk of frustration, no intentions, etc., etc. So what kind of moral consideration various kinds of animals are worthy of depends on their mental capacities, widely conceived, rather than the other way around. It hinges on questions like, can they experience pain? Can they act intentionally? Can they have beliefs, desires, emotions, plans for the future, etc.? Okay, now I want to, I think I will only be able to demonstrate this with respect to one morally relevant mental property, namely sentience. Sentience, here understood, is the capacity to have bodily sensations, to feel pleasure and pain. Now, you'd be surprised, but there are not just philosophers, but cognitive scientists who deny that animals feel pain. If you think that's absurd, you have my sympathies, but I'm a philosopher, so I need to consider these, rather exotic possibilities. Okay, so there is an interesting, you can always learn from philosophers, I'd say, even if they go terribly wrong. There is an interesting argument against animals, non-linguistic animals having sentience. So there are philosophers like Peter Carruthers, for instance, who credit animals with cognitive capacities. There are highly intelligent animals, animals which can, acquire cognition, they can acquire knowledge about their environment, and nevertheless they don't feel pain, Carruthers once held. Now why? So they have cognitive capacities, but sensations require consciousness. Yeah, you can operate very proficiently, but that doesn't mean that you have sensations, because sensations, only a being that has consciousness can have sensations. And then, and this is the problematic point, they think that consciousness is a higher order capacity which requires consciousness of your own mental states. So they say sentience requires consciousness, but consciousness requires that you're conscious of your own mental states. And then they go on to think that, animals don't have this kind of self-consciousness. But I think that, the trouble really is this final claim. It sort of sounds initially appealing, in order to be conscious, you must also be self-conscious. But I think there's a simple confusion here between a state that a subject is conscious of. Yeah? For instance, I'm now conscious of the fact that I am nervous about time management, and a state in which I am conscious. Yeah? There are many states in which I am conscious. When I looked at you without giving any thought to my own mental states, I was conscious. But I was conscious of the audience, I wasn't conscious of myself. So, there are states which we are conscious of, for instance, when we are fretting about an exam. But we are in many conscious states which are not self-conscious in this sense. We are not aware of them. We are conscious of other things, but these are not states in which we entertain thoughts about our own thoughts. And so a creature can be conscious, it can have consciousness of its environment, it can feel pleasure and pain without, therefore, having the capacity of being self-conscious. So, okay, I'll leave that out because I am nervous about time management. Okay, now I'll just quickly go through one possible, no, I won't. Lucky you. Okay, so I will just consider one argument against animal sensation that many people find quite appealing. It's pointing out that there can be pain without pain behavior and pain behavior without pain, right? If you're a Stoic or a Spartan or a yogi, then you may be able to suppress your pain, you not show it in your behavior in any way. And conversely, there can be pain behavior without pain. You can simulate being in pain. And therefore, the argument is, well, how do we know that the adverse reactions that animals show to harmful stimuli are a sign of pain? Couldn't it be that they feel nothing at all, they just behave mechanically in response to certain threats or harmful stimuli? But, and I'll then leave the painful topic of pain behind me, if this were a sufficient reason to disregard pain behavior altogether, it would open the floodgate to a general skepticism about other minds. Because, what evidence do I have to say of you that you feel a pain when you hit yourself on the thumb with a hammer? I mean, all I have to go by is your behavior. Perhaps your behavior includes language, but why should that make a difference? Why is the statement, ouch, or it hurts, more reliable as an indicator of a feeling of pain than simply screaming? There was some English author who didn't utter a word till the age of 3, and then his nanny poured hot tea over him, and she said to him, I hope it doesn't hurt. And he supposedly replied, don't worry, madam, the pain has abated. Who was it? But, obviously, we don't need that sort of thing. If behavior like screaming, avoiding, assuaging your limb, all of which, chimpanzees, for instance, do, is not sufficient to display that a creature suffers from pain, then, we should ask ourselves whether the people around us suffer pain, whether they aren't just what are called zombies, nobody at home. They behave like us, but nobody's at home. Okay, so now I will skip quite a lot and come to morality, which maybe, oh God, there are many premises here. I should, oops. Never mind. It's a shame because I was going to mention one unduly neglected German philosopher, Leonard Nelson, but anyway. So now what is the moral for animal ethics of my ruminations? So I do think of, although I've only talked about sensations, that the morally, the philosophical arguments which are purporting to show that animals can't have sensations, can't have interests, can't have beliefs, can't act, they only behave, can't choose, etc., etc. The arguments that there are qualitative mental differences between humans and animals are, in my view, all and sundry insufficient. They don't convince. Nevertheless, and this is where it gets dicey, in my view, the moral status of humans is qualitatively distinct from that of even higher animals. our moral obligations towards each other are of a different order from our moral obligations towards non-human animals. And indeed, some of my arguments against what I called differentialism can also be used to show that there are morally relevant differences. It is just that these differences are not adequately captured by strict dichotomies, however venerable these dichotomies may be. And I'll skip. So if we want to ascribe animals not sensations perhaps, but beliefs, desires, goals, etc., we must have a basis on which to ascribe these mental states. Yeah? We must have criteria, as philosophers are fond of saying, for identifying these beliefs, desires, goals. As I said before, if an animal is to entertain, if an animal is to be able of psychological altruism, it must ascribe certain desires and beliefs to another animal. But how do we ascribe desires and beliefs in the absence of language? If it comes to ascribing desires and beliefs, for instance, the desire to leave this lecture hall as soon as possible, to you, the ultimate way of finding out is to ask you. And if you give me a sincere answer, I can, decide what it is you desire. But how do we do this in the case of non-linguistic animals? Something must count as believing one thing, namely this lecture is dragging on for way too long, rather than believing another thing. For instance, this lecture is frightfully interesting. Yeah? You must have a basis for ascribing one belief rather than the other. Something must count as desiring one thing, namely getting off the bus, as opposed to another, namely staying on till the next stop. And so I don't think that beliefs and desires must actually be manifested in behavior, but a subject of beliefs and desires must be capable of manifesting its beliefs and desires. And only a very restricted range of beliefs and desires can be manifested in the behavior of non-linguistic creatures. So, as Wittgenstein once put it, a dog can believe that its master is at the door, but a dog cannot believe that its master will return in a week's time. On what basis could we can ascribe, the belief that its master is at the door by the fact that the dog is wagging its tail and, joyfully running towards the door, for instance, or giving, an emphatic bark. But on what grounds could we ascribe to the dog the belief, the prediction that its master will return in a week's time? I mean, we simply don't have a leg to stand on. So I think that beliefs and desires about the distant past and future, as well as a moral sense, a sense of beauty, a sense of history or dignity, self-consciousness, concerning one's own death and ultimate aims, and etc., lie beyond the range of thoughts that animals are capable of displaying. And if they're incapable of displaying them, then at the very least, there is no point in ascribing these thoughts to them. I've added arguably because, behavioral scientists continue to surprise us by finding ingenious ways of ascribing to animals for instance, one desire rather than another. So this is all provisional, not just in the sense that science tells us new things about animal behavior all the time, but also that behavioral scientists are capable of thinking up new ways of getting at animal minds, new methods. This is, I think, important to me. In order to set our moral obligations towards each other apart, we do not need the traditional very sharp distinctions like we humans experience pain, animals only react to bodily damage. We humans have interests, for instance, we want this and reject that. They merely have wants, they need certain things. We believe propositions, for instance, that water boils at 100 degrees Celsius. They only register objects. We act for reasons, they only behave mechanically or instinctively. We communicate by way of language. The best that they are capable of is to signal, and so on and so forth. These are all very traditional ways of setting ourselves apart from animals. I don't think any of them hold water. I think that, it's not that we experience pain, they don't. We believe things, desire things, they don't. We act for reasons, they merely behave. We communicate, they don't. I think that's the wrong way of drawing the distinction. Insisting, it suffices, I want to say, that we perceive, believe, desire, communicate, feel, etc., a lot more than they do, and in a hugely more complex fashion. That's the point. We perceive more, we believe more, we feel more, we intend more, we communicate more or about more, and we do so in a way which far exceeds what animals do. I mean, our way, we don't just say more than animals, just to elaborate on the final point. It's not just that we communicate more than animals, but we do so in a much more complex fashion. Human language is, I think, fairly unique. I do think the fact that we can do more is sufficient because we here have a very profound philosophical idea. I'm not into profundity normally, but I do think that we have what in some philosophers would call a transformation of a quantitative into a qualitative difference. A difference in moral quality, a difference in moral status can arise out of a difference in mental quantity. So this is an idea which is traditionally associated with two other German philosophers, Hegel and Marx, and I'm not terribly fond of them by and large, but I do think the idea that the fact that our communication, our beliefs, our desires, our aspirations are so much richer and more complex means that there is a lot more to be morally respected when it comes to humans than there is in the case of animals. And with that thought, I apologize for having overextended my welcome. Thank you. So,
yes, thank you so much. I think you earned some extra time lost trying to click through slides.
Oh, I should have timed that, yes.
Thank you so much.
Just for the record.
If you put your hands up, someone will come with a mic. So we have two on this side, Joe, and keep your hands up so you can be seen.
Are they on?
Yeah. Can you see them?
What would you call it with my Welsh Border Collie? On one occasion...
I have
can you hear me?
No, well, I can hear you, but not... No, okay.
Just put it a bit closer.
Put it so it's...
I could decide to hear you, but...
Can you hear me now?
Now, yes.
Right, what would you call it with a Border Collie, my Border Collie, actually going out for a walk and me stepping into a puddle and she stood crouching at the other end watching to see that I wasn't going to disappear into Narnia or whatever. But it happened that one time, then I thought that's coincidence.
Could you just repeat? So your collie observed you stepping into
a puddle. She
okay.
stood down, crouched down, watching me as I walked through it.
Okay.
Came back later and did the same. She went the other side
Okay.
and watching me. Another occasion we've had, I've been out with walks in the park with dogs, all loose in this particular green recreation grounds. Lots of different sized dogs. They played, they've actually shared balls, and they've considered the smaller dogs considerately. So what would you have a comfort? And also my dog recognising that I shouldn't be carrying on with the family racing ahead, stopped, insisted that we go for another walk. I realised that's what she was on about, because I taught her with actually praise. I never taught her with bits of food, etc. She actually wanted to go for a short, quiet walk, and I only discovered afterwards I had an infected leg.
Okay. Now, I think there are different issues here. One is, so this concerns my skepticism about animals having moral sentiments, right? And I said, although animals are proper objects of moral consideration, they themselves don't have anything like morality. Now, when it comes to one of your examples, I don't think I have a lot of trouble. Animals, and this is very important, are not driven by instincts or exclusively. They can adopt new goals of their own. You know, they can learn to enjoy things they don't, hadn't enjoyed, and in particular, they can set themselves rather arbitrary goals in play behavior, right? So the fact that the dogs you mention, I take it, were rather accommodating to a small dog. Is that was?
Well,
the
they
point?
were a crowd of different sized dogs,
Okay.
all playing together happily.
They just like
Not
to play.
conflicting.
Yes, that's
Let
right.
some
They like to play.
tumbling.
I mean, well, I think there's a
sharing
misunderstanding.
balls. Sharing
Oh, yeah,
balls
well,
with
yes,
each other.
I mean, that's true, but
We need to learn
you know, that's a bit like Tottenham Hotspurs, the team sharing a ball. They like to play with each other. I wouldn't impute a lot of altruism to the individual players. Sorry, no, but I mean, it's clear. They are interested in playing, right?
Yes.
And in order to play, you have to cooperate. I'm not denying that animals can cooperate. I mean, no way. I mean, we know. I mean, even rather primitive. I wouldn't say even social insects or superorganisms like ants. You know, they obviously cooperate. The question is whether they. First of all, whether what they are doing is under their control, and secondly, insofar as it is under their control, and I think what dogs do is under their control, it is driven by moral sentiment. And I think the fact that dogs play with each other is not, I don't think is evidence for that.
But they allow another dog to walk away with the ball and will look at it watchfully, but
Yeah, because, you know,
So,
I mean, yes, because, I mean, if you want to play ball, you have to share the ball occasionally. So, I mean, I don't really see that this is a case of thinking, well, it will hurt me to see that ball, you know, in the jaws of, I don't know, Fido, right? But I'll let it happen nonetheless. I do think that they like a certain kind of interaction.
Well, Dr. Glock, do you think perhaps our own morality is our own need for our survival because we haven't got the capabilities that animals have to survive?
Well, morality exists for some purpose, but that doesn't mean that our motivations are the same as those of dogs. But very quickly, it is clear that dogs have a sense of often a surprising sense of the physical and emotional states of their human companions, right? And it is, you know, clear that in your story the dog noted that you were limping, I guess? So, anyway, okay.
I think we should.
Yeah, okay,
There's another
anyway,
question
yes.
at the
Yeah.
front here. Yeah.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
You seem to have made a lot of comparisons during your talk, evaluating the sort of mental ability or moral ability of animals with those of humans in the first half.
Of humans, yes.
Of humans, yes. My point is there is no such thing as a standard human. I mean, we vary in, for example, mental ability between, let's say, scientists and politicians, and perhaps even lower than that on occasion. There's no such thing as a standard human. So do you have a standard human that you want to, that you take as to compare against?
I certainly don't have a standard human, but I do think that although there are humans that individually lack many of the mental capacities that I mentioned here, what sets us apart is the capacities which sustain human communities. I do think there's no feature that, no mental feature that all humans possess and no animals possess. Yeah? So I agree that but there is a profound difference at the level of human versus animal communities, and I do think that it's important to recognize this. I mean, this is a fairly complex event, but it's not the most complex thing humans have ever done, and it far outstrips anything you find in the animal kingdom. So what I want to say is there's no standard human, but there are certain capacities which are essential to all human communities and which are therefore, if you wish, an essential part of the human form of life. No human community functions without the kind of understanding of causal relationships which sustains at least simple types of technology, tools. No human community functions without language, which is a highly complex, uniquely complex form of communication. No human community functions without cooperation and division of labor. So even though individual members of human communities may not have those abilities are essential to the human form of life nonetheless.
That's fine, thank you very much.
There were a few questions at the far back. Tamira will bring a mic. Can you put your hand up if you had a hand at the far back?
Professor, first to say thank you. It's, I really sort of recognize the expertise and the depth of your work, but I have some reservations, and so really permission to be provocative, if I may.
Oh, certainly.
Great.
I didn't, pull my punches either.
Thank you so much. So, one of this is everything you say is very much predicated. I know you do qualify it. It's predicated on a very anthropocentric paradigm. And I couldn't help thinking, and this is where I'm going to be provocative, is that if you and I were sitting back in the 1800s and looking at colonization, we could have come up with a very similar sort of structure as to why individuals during the sort of colonization period were different, from the Western world, for instance. And I think that's my fear, is that from this sort of, the Cartesian approach and our silos and our education system, unfortunately, I don't think we're able to, I don't think we do justice to what effectively is an ecosystem, that they are really part, of, our community, which is beyond just human-centric, because I think, just we're not machines. And we live, and we need an environment where all of these animals play a part. We've messed it up, of course, with our farming and our interference, but there's something I feel inherently wrong in trying to compare or trying to give ourselves a sort of a higher order. And I don't have a religious affiliation, although, I respect all of the sort of values, but there's something wrong with this, anthropocentric paradigm. And forgive me, slightly sort of patriarchal, and it doesn't rest with me, but I respect, your research and your candor and your work, but it's, yeah.
Okay. I don't think anything I said is patriarchal. I'm not aware of it. I mean, but I would perhaps be accused of what's called a speciesism. I can't even ever write that correctly. The idea that if you draw any morally significant distinctions between humans and non-human animals, then you are also committed to drawing noxious, sinister distinctions between types of human beings. Now, I resent that accusation, quite frankly, because what I stressed is that there are mental capacities which allow human beings to interact in a unique manner, to form communities which are unique, as on this planet. And I don't see for the world of me that whatever differences there are between different races, and they are, by any standard, very minimal, impose any sort of barrier to the type of interaction, the type of intimacy, the type of cooperation that we are capable of. Yeah, I mean, even those die-hard slaveholders interacted with their slaves, obviously subject to a horrific system of exploitation and suppression, but they spoke to each other. There was no difference in the level of linguistic communication, and they were capable of cooperation. And even the die-hard slaveholders and even die-hard ideologues of slavery, like Aristotle, who was the worst of the lot, admitted that on a day-to-day basis, it's hard to tell those slaves apart from, fully paid-up Athenian citizens. So I just deny that in the 18th century you and I could have sat together and told ourselves, but the slaves working on the plantations, they are just machines. They don't have any feelings, and so on and so forth. I do think that, of course people did, but it conflicted with their everyday experience. It conflicted with their with the way in which they were capable of interacting with slaves. I don't even see how anyone could deny that, not even they. And it took a very sinister superstructure of ideology in order to justify their exploitation. So I think that distinguishing us from humans is absolutely okay, has got no sense of racism about it, because the differences which divide humans from animals are so much greater than the differences that divide humans.
Let's move on. There was a question further back, I think. Can you put your hand up again? Or no longer?
There's a gentleman over there.
So maybe We can bring the mic back to the gentleman over here.
Is that working?
Yep.
Right. Can we come back to animals then? You seem throughout your lecture to be, in some sense, suggesting that the animal has to have some moral sense of its own in order to earn a moral sense from me. My moral sense is inside me, and whatever moral duties I take on board are about what I feel, and not at all about what kind of capacity the animals that that I may interact with. I'm a hypocrite, of course, because I think that I'm an animal lover, but I eat meat. But nevertheless, I don't need any creature to have a particular capacity to feel some moral duty towards him. I won't stamp on something just because I'm able to, or it's crawling across the road in front of me, and I don't ask whether it can feel pain before I don't do it.
Well,
So do you need any particular level of mental capacity before a human being can feel some moral duty towards that creature?
Well, I think that you may have misconstrued my argument. I think I said there are these two different questions, namely the question of whether we have moral obligations towards animals and the question of whether they have moral sentiments of their own, whether they feel moral obligations. I said, there is a position, contractualism, which would, conform to your, Aunt Sally that you just created, someone who sits back and thinks, well, if they don't have moral sentiments, I can do whatever I want. But I explicitly distanced myself from that. And I explicitly said even that plants, and you're not going to impute to me the idea that plants have moral sentiments, that even plants are worthy of moral consideration. So the answer is clearly, I don't think that, in order for an animal to be worthy of moral respect, it must have a morality of its own. What I did say is that the kind of, leaving aside plants and needs and this very low level of moral respect, if something has biological needs, we should, not wantonly frustrate those needs. But leaving that aside, I did commit myself to the idea that you must have certain moral capacities in order to invite certain moral considerations. And it's very simple. If you don't feel pain or pleasure, then it makes no sense to, if an organism doesn't feel pleasure or pain, then it can't be my moral obligation to provide it with pleasure and to avoid it feeling pain. If an organism doesn't have interests, plans and goals, then I can't have a moral obligation to avoid frustrating those interests or propagating their fulfillment. So that's, to that extent, I think you are right. I do make certain types of moral obligation dependent on certain types of mental properties. But, I don't feel any compunction about, putting my foot down on this, on this floor. Because the floor doesn't feel pain. I don't think it's disrespectful of me to step on the floor because the floor doesn't have a sense of dignity, etc., etc. So,
The floor doesn't have any sentient either.
well, exactly, that was my point. It doesn't feel pleasure or pain. And therefore, in order for me to be restricted in my interaction with a certain object in a moral way, it must have some of these morally relevant properties.
We have time.
I'm sorry. Well, anyway, I don't want to. Yeah.
I think there are other questions. We have
Okay.
time for a couple more.
There's a certain self-interest in this because, as you rightly said, the whole complex of life depends on each other. And if we don't respect all kinds of life, including plant life, we're stuffed because it will go up out the window.
But that's not contradicting anything I said, frankly, because, but let me just say, and this is very important, in my view, there's a fundamental mistake about both proponents and opponents of, certain forms of animal welfare and animal ethics, and that is the idea that possessing moral value is an all or nothing affair. And that seems to me to be dead wrong. To deny all moral status is evil, and to deny and to include, jellyfish in considerations about future life plans makes no sense whatsoever. So, I think we need to acknowledge that having moral status cannot possibly be an all or nothing affair.
Last chance for a question. Sam's first.
Oh, there are two, yeah.
Maybe you're nearer, I think.
You make a lot about sentience and the capacity to feel pain. You also mentioned people who congenitally don't feel pain. So I wondered whether what you've said implies that their moral status is reduced compared to normal human beings.
Well, I'm very happy to bite the bullet that if you have someone who suffers from, I think it's called CIP or something like that, then since this person is incapable of feeling pain, certain things which consist exclusively in what otherwise would be pain would be permissible, which would not be with normal people. But of course, that is only a theoretical option because most ways of inflicting pain imply bodily damage, right? And of course, if so, and the reason why this is such a serious affliction, congenital inability to feel pain, is that it prevents a sufferer from noting bodily damage. So, on the highly theoretical assumption that, some interest of someone else would be served by my stepping on the toes of such a person with the guarantee that the toe is not impaired, then I'll bite the bullet and say, well, in that case, it's not morally wrong. But as I said, it's a very theoretical possibility.
And nothing wrong with torturing people during their sleep using an electroshock treatment that left no body damage.
There is something wrong because they are but nothing wrong with torturing people in their sleep. I must say it. I just wonder about the frame of mind, which but of course I'm a philosopher, so there is something wrong. But I do think that it has something to do with what Kant called indirect duties. Kant thought we should avoid cruelty towards animals, but not because animals have any inherent moral significance, but because inflicting pain and other harm on animals would desensitize us when it comes to our interactions with humans. Now, if again, I guess I'm prepared to bite the bullet. If, apart from the fact that it would be perverse to want to do this, and I think there are many considerations which are not moral considerations, if a purpose were fulfilled by putting electrodes to an otherwise fully intelligent and so on human being that would not be damaged by it and would not feel it, then I would say yes. But as I said, I mean, although I'm a philosopher, I do think ethics should be for the real world. And I don't see that scenario. But if you give me a realistic scenario...
It's your theory, so the implications of it, if they're a bit unrealistic, it's not really my fault.
No, it's not. No. I'm not saying that it's your fault. But I'm saying is that I'm willing to bite the bullet of saying if an interest were served, if it would not lead me to do very strange and nasty things to people that do feel pain, then I'd have to say this is not morally wrong.
We'll take one final question, Joe on the fourth row here. Yeah.
So most of what you're saying has been applying or thinking about ethical behavior towards individual animals, organisms. Do you think there are different standards that need to be applied to multiple animals, species, on a species level perhaps, so that whilst it might not be wrong morally for whatever reason to kill a single bee, killing millions upon millions of bees becomes wrong? Is there a question of quantity?
Yes, yeah. I mean, that is a very interesting issue. Now, I am, I would say, by most standards, a pretty radical environmentalist. So I think that there is something wrong, of course, ecologically speaking. I have difficulties to decide whether, ecological thinking is just prudential thinking. We just, preserve the planet for ourselves and our children and grandchildren, and deciding whether there is, whether there are other types of values which come into play. So even if the extinction of, let's say, a particular form of microbe would not have any detrimental effects further along any ecological chain, would it not be per se wrong? I tend to think yes, right? I think, species are just something marvelous and wonderful, irrespective of our the use they have for us, irrespective of the killing or inflicting harm on individual specimen. Yeah? And these are wonderful phenomena. But I don't want to say that this is a moral value. I mean, I do think that, and this is another issue on which I'm rather insistent. We shouldn't overextend the sphere of moral thinking. There are perfectly respectable other reasons for valuing something, aesthetic reasons, for instance. And so I'm a bit torn between thinking that, preservation of species is highly important for ecological reasons, which are, at least to a large extent, prudential reasons. It's good for us to avoid mass extinction, and and there are aesthetic reasons. But I haven't made up my mind about that. I'm happy to be convinced that there's a kind of ethical dimension to preserving species. But I don't need that ethical dimension in order to say, for heaven's sake, let's avoid mass extinction.
We have a finger on this, I think, and then we'll end.
Yeah.
May I just suggest an ethical basis for the feeling that one should preserve species, which actually connects with the idea of valuing persons and animals that can think and have a sense of their future, is the idea of irreplaceability. One's own future is irreplaceable to oneself, a whole species is irreplaceable. A loved pet might be irreplaceable. A relative in a coma might be irreplaceable, even though they can no longer be conscious. So for those reasons, one may not want to damage those people.
Okay. Well, I think irreplaceability is, of course, a very good argument against destroying something or allowing it to be destroyed. But it's the reasons are not always moral, I find. I mean, I think that my current bicycle is irreplaceable. I've never find anything like that. But I don't, I don't think that's a, a moral type of irreplaceability. But I mean, I'm very happy to consider the idea that, I mean, there are bad things which are also, I mean, one of a kind, and they're, yeah. So,
it wouldn't be sufficient on its own.
Yes.
I was just going to say thank you for a lecture that was one of a kind, but then you said that last thing. But can we thank Professor Glock for a wonderful lecture?
Well, no, thank you. Thank you very much.